Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you again for joining us for another installment of Palestine in Session. My name is Tariq Khalil, Education Coordinator with American Muslims for Palestine. The title for today's session is The U.S. Israel Special Relationship, a Strategic and Moral Responsibility. We have a wonderful panel to discuss this very important topic, a topic that I feel is more relevant to discuss today than ever before. Just in the last few months, Israel launched the largest assault on the Jenin refugee camp since the Second Intifada more than 20 years ago. Settler violence spread like wildfire in Turmus Aya, and another round of settler incursions and Israeli occupation forces invading Masjid al-Aqsa during Ramadan, and of course, displacement via home demolitions and other means in areas such as Silwan, my hometown, Sheikh Jarrah, Musafir Yatta, and throughout the rest of the West Bank. This is not to mention Israeli policy of starvation and strangulation for Gaza and maintaining second-class and third-class status for Israel's Palestinian citizens inside the 1948 area. All of this strengthened by Israel's most right-wing government in history. So I didn't mention a lot of facts there, just a quick summary of just recent events and atrocities. And this is only an hour segment, so we can't go through the entirety of the Nakba period of 75 years. All I can say is we know how bad this is for Palestinians, but this cannot be good for the United States image abroad. And it certainly can't benefit Americans since we, and I say we because it's our tax dollars, provide Israel with $3.8 billion each year, if not more, with supplemental spending. And this contributes to the oppression of the Palestinian people. A strategic and moral liability seems like an understatement. And with that said, now to our panel, just a brief bio for each of them. Thank you all for being here. We have with us Lara Friedman, who is the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, with more than 25 years working in the Middle East foreign policy arena. Lara is a leading authority on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with particular expertise on the Israeli-Arab conflict, Israeli settlements, Jerusalem, and the role of the U.S. Congress. Lara was the director of policy and government relations at Americans for Peace Now, and before that, she was a U.S. Foreign Service officer serving in Jerusalem, Washington, Tunis, and Beirut. We also have with us Raed Jarrar. He's an Arab-American political advocate based in Washington, D.C. Since 2005, he worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to the U.S. engagement in the Arab world. He's an expert on political issues, social issues, economic developments in the MENA region, and has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings, and is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, just to name a few. He's on the advisory board of the organization Air Wars, and he's a former advocacy director with AMP, and is currently the advocacy director for democracy for the Arab world now. We also have with us Yousef Munayyer, who is the head of Palestine Israel program and senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Previously, he directed the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center, a DC-based center focused on Palestine policy. He serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal of Palestine Studies and was previously executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Some of his articles can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, and Journal of Palestine Studies, among many others. Sorry, I had to cut all of your bios short, but we have a very important topic to get to, and I want to start off with you, Lara. I want to start off with just the overarching question that kind of encapsulates this whole session. Why does the U.S. support Israel?
Thank you. Thanks for that question, and thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be back with you and talking about this topic, which is obviously timely. Certainly, if you've been watching the news in recent days, and particularly here in Washington in the past week. Why does the U.S. support Israel? You told me you were going to ask me that, and I tried to get down some notes because, entire books have been written about this, many of them giving different arguments. It's sort of, you can look at this from all different angles. I think sort of to answer this telegraphically, if we go back to the roots of U.S. support for Israel, back when Israel was declared itself a state, You had the context of World War II and the Holocaust and the horror of what happened to Jewish people in the Holocaust. You had guilt around the U.S. role in that. And you had a very, very strong domestic lobby in the U.S. that was determined to get U.S. support for this. And I think that was quite effective. I will say, for folks who don't know this, that if you go back to that era of history, Jewish Americans were not hugely enthusiastic about the state of Israel. The idea of creating a sovereign state of Israel for a Jewish community in the United States that had grown in previous decades and was assimilating well and had a growing sense of strength and being at home as American citizens, there was deep discomfort. You can go back and see this in various books and conversations. And the sort of idea that support for Israel was a consensus Jewish American perspective really didn't develop until after 67 and 73. So I think it's important to understand that. But if you go sort of jump ahead to that period when it did become consensus, look, I mean, we have some very powerful, foundational arguments, foundational myths, foundational ethos here. And some of that is the shared values. You have two states here that are grounded in the idea of manifest destiny, right? That appeals not just to Jewish Americans. That's a very American idea, which is only really in recent generations, which have gone back and looked at U.S. complicity in atrocities and deprivation of rights of indigenous peoples. That's a very recent thing for most Americans. So this manifest destiny, the idea of a shared democratic nation, and frankly, let's be clear, this is shared European values, right? You're creating effectively a European approach in the Middle East. You also had at that time, and we can go back to the Cold War framing a little bit, the idea of Israel being an outpost of U.S. loyalty and interests in the region, from which the U.S. can help manage what are seen as direct geostrategic threats in the region. That was a major argument back in the day. And then you also have a whole set of issues that became, I want to say, folded into this. And I'm separating this from the question of lobbying for a second. But you have a whole set of interests that became implicated very quickly, as from the get-go, the U.S. was a main supplier of weapons to Israel. Right? And as soon as, however you feel about the U.S. supplying weapons to Israel, the bottom line is that they're supplying weapons that are manufactured by U.S. companies, which becomes an income stream. You have an entire military-industrial complex which has a very strong interest in the continuation of the U.S. commitment to Israel. So separate from any sort of ideological or religious interest. Mixed with that, as we've moved forward in time, and I don't want to say that there wasn't a Christian Zionist messianic commitment to Israel from day one, but that certainly is something that exploded. Maybe exploded is the wrong word, but grew very rapidly in the past, I would say 3 or 4 decades, maybe 3 decades. I'm thinking of the advent of Christians United for Israel and the like. And there you have essentially a new center of power, which is much less interested in the shared values framework and is very interested in its own sort of religious play that it wants to see played out on the ground, in which, frankly, Jewish people are bit actors in a larger drama that they want to see played out, but that is dependent on the strong U.S. relationship there. In terms of where the relationship is today, I mean, you can go back to the foundational myths about shared values. The shared values argument, we heard it yesterday from the president of Israel. It becomes, in some ways, harder to understand, given that the Israeli government of the past, 50 years has been moving closer and closer and closer to an openly authoritarian government towards its own citizens. That's separate from, for people who manage to keep a cognitive dissonance, we'll judge Israel's democracy only by how it treats its own citizens, not by how it treats people who are completely under its control who aren't citizens, which is an incredibly bizarre way to evaluate a democracy. But even if you accept that, the idea that today you're going to talk about shared values, the shared values maybe make sense if you think about the people who are most energetically cheering the current Israeli government on the U.S. side, who are people who probably would like to see the same sort of illiberal reforms in the U.S. as are taking shape in Israel. But that's a different idea of shared values, and it's certainly not the ones that people think they're talking about. Beyond that, you have obviously political realities. We now have, 55 years since 67. If you just date it from 67, we now have 5+ decades of policies which are predicated on a strong role for Israel to play in our elections process in terms of expecting a certain amount of report from members of Congress, from candidates, in terms of imposing pain on members of Congress and candidates who don't live up to that, pain politically, as we saw in the past few days with the Jayapal kerfuffle, or with Ilhan Omar or Rashid Tlaib, anytime they speak on this issue, and pain at the in the actual elections, as we saw. For people who got mad when Congresswoman Omar said it was all about the Benjamins, and then just a few years later, you have AIPAC actually launch its own PAC, which invests millions and millions of dollars to defeat progressive candidates in primaries, while basically, their only thing they care about is whether they think those people be good or bad on Israel, and largely hide it from the primary voters. You basically now have all of these interwoven pieces in place, which means that moving away from this kind of knee-jerk, tell me where to go, tell me where to stand, tell me what to say approach on Israel is going to be really difficult. It's deeply ingrained. And the last thing I'll say, and I think probably one of the other panels will say more about this, the fact is that now more than ever, all of what I've just described as U.S. policy is not aligned where American voters are, right? We've just seen another study that came out, and this is of Democrats and Republicans. We've known this for quite a while about younger Americans. Younger Americans aren't particularly fond of a policy which says there's an exception for Israel and everything they believe in. Voters in general are not super Zionist. And they're not super happy about conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So you have a growing chasm between politicians and the people. So where we see change going forward, it's going to come from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for putting all of that together in just a few minutes. I'm sure there's a lot of points that go into that question. But and it's interesting that you mentioned the polling data because regarding the recent polls, that younger generation of the Gallup poll and Pew Research poll, they distinguish between moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats, and the liberal Democrats have completely crossed the threshold already within that younger generation, and they're more pro-Palestinian in their orientation. So we have definitely come a long way. And Raed, I want to go straight to you since we were on the topic, since I mentioned USaid. And we all know this. Well, I hope, it's good for Americans to know this, that Israel is the largest recipient of USaid since World War II and receives more foreign military financing than all the other countries in the world combined, providing it with the most advanced military equipment in the world. And I guess my question is centered around that. How does this enormous aid impact the moral image of the U.S. abroad, and does it provide any benefit to American citizens at home? Do we gain anything from $3.8 million of aid every single year?
$3.8 billion of aid.
Billion. Did I say million?
Yeah,
I said billion.
I think I will answer your question in short first. I think it impacts the United States moral image very negatively. And the second question is about what do we gain from that at home? I would say very little. Depends on who you ask for, but I think for an average American or for our national interest as a country, we gain very little. The United States does provide Israel with the largest foreign military financing in the world. As you indicated, Tariq, it is more than half of the entirety of the foreign military financing account of the United States, which means that the entire world combined gets less than Israel by itself. But that's not the only way that Israel is exceptional. It's not just with the amount that we give Israel. It's also the quality. Israel gets a different kind of weapons, and that is embedded in the agreements between the United States and Israel. There is a vaguely worded rule called the qualitative military edge that Israel has to have, even if they get the same kind of a weapon. It has to be a little bit more advanced than any other weapon similar to it given to other countries in the region. So you see that it's not just about the amount, it's about the quality. And of course, it's about the absolute blank check where Israel gets all of the United States support with no accountability whatsoever, even in cases where the United States government has been breaching our own laws to circumvent systems of accountability that we have in the United States. Like, for example, Israel, although it has received tens of billions of dollars in military aid, although there are hundreds of cases of gross violations of human rights that were documented by reputable sources around the world, of Israel committing extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearance, other gross violations of human rights, and in many cases, war crimes committed in breach to laws of war and international humanitarian law. Israel has never in its history had a single action taken against it by the United States by suspending U.S. military aid to the offending units inside of Israel, or by suspending U.S. aid to Israel as a country. So there are requirements in U.S. law that should prohibit the United States from funding and aiding extra foreign security units accused of committing gross violations of human rights. We have most of these laws for foreign military financing fall under the Foreign Assistance Act and its amendments. One of them is called the Leahy Amendment, after former Senator Leahy. That amendment is implemented at least 1,000 times every year. According to statistics, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 times a year, the United States suspends foreign military units who are involved in gross violations of human rights. Not a single Israeli soldier has been suspended, not one. Israel has so many other ways to enjoy this exceptional bank check. For example, Israel is the only country in the world that we give them the entirety of their foreign military financing in the first 30 days of the fiscal year. Everyone else actually gets it throughout the year. Israel is the only country in the world that has no end-use monitoring mechanism. We don't know where our weapons end. It's a breach of U.S. law, including the Foreign Assistance Act, including the Arms Export Control Act, and other regulations, to not have an end-use monitoring mechanism. We don't have it with Israel. So it's really, you see, like the political exceptionalism translates into creating, these unheard of kind of maneuvers to avoid abiding by U.S. or international standards when it comes to Israel. So the United States image is impacted by that. The United States is seen as an active party to oppressing Palestinians, to killing Palestinians, to participating in the crime against humanity of apartheid that is being maintained by this unconditional U.S. role. So that is the impact. The impact comes from not only the U.S. contributing to Israeli capabilities, but also for the United States giving Israel this blanket check, a cover, a political cover at the United Nations. Politically in DC, we hear these, lines repeated regularly about how Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel, has to fight against terrorism. So we have these packaged one-liners that are spewed on podiums in Washington D.C. to avoid accountability. So the United States moral image has been harmed a lot in the region and around the world. The United States has no moral or political capital left to present itself as a broker for peace, as someone with a higher moral grounds, because the United States is seen as a partner in crime. So I would say that answers the second part of your question as well, because as ordinary citizens, not the ones that, like Lara was mentioning, the military industrial complex that's making billions of dollars, not those, like ordinary citizens in the US, we're not benefiting from giving billions of dollars to Israel. We're not benefiting from replicating racist and oppressive mistakes that this country has committed in the past out there without condemning them. We have had similar issues of racial segregation and apartheid and racism in our own country that we're still struggling with. And I think that's also an issue that affects us here in the US. When US citizens see our own government contribute to the budget of a racist apartheid state like Israel with our tax dollars, that this is also gives the wrong message for us here home.
No, thank you so much, Raed. And I think that's why there's a growing number of Americans that are seeing the reality for what it is and not really giving into the talking points that pervades mainstream media, and they're seeing the oppressor-oppressed relationship. And on that point of public opinion and where public opinion has shifted, Yousef, I want to turn to you. So we've seen the discourse change drastically, I would say, since 2015, probably even a little before that. And U.S. polls show, as we've mentioned, that the younger generation have already crossed the threshold into sympathizing more with Palestinians. How would you explain that development, that shift in public opinion, and how can we keep that movement going?
Thank you all. Can you hear me okay?
It's okay.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that question. And I just wanted to, before I get into that, add a bit to what Raed was saying and tie it back to what Lara was talking about, and also tie it into your question. I think one of the things that really exposes so much about the extent of how special, let's say, the U.S. Israel relationship is the extent to which the United States goes against its own interests with this foreign military financing program. Raed talked about some of these instances, some of these exceptions. But one thing that I don't think Raed mentioned is that the foreign military financing program is supposed to be used to give credit to foreign militaries to purchase weapons from the United States. In other words, the money gets spent in the United States. And there are some people who will argue that, well, this military aid to Israel is actually being spent in the United States, and therefore it's boosting our defense industry and so on and so forth. But there's only one country in the entire world in the foreign military financing program that gets an exception to that rule, that gets to spend up to 26% of the $3.8 billion a year, not in the United States, but in its own domestic military industries. The United States has actually been subsidizing not just the Israeli military, but also Israeli military industries, to the point now that Israel, a relatively small country when you think about it, has become a major player in exporting arms around the world. And in some instances, even competing with U.S. defense manufacturers for contracts in different countries. So this is part of a monstrosity that the American taxpayer has contributed to, and Israel is now also selling weapons to very unsavory regimes around the world, with which it's creating alliances with, including Kagame's regime in Rwanda, Modi's regime in India. They've sold weapons to Myanmar, which is under U.S. sanctions, the junta there, and so on and so forth. So the implications of this, the reverberations of this, are much greater than just what it means for U.S. defense manufacturers, but actually it has an impact on human rights around the world. And as Raed mentioned, there is only one country, again, surprise, surprise, that gets an exception to the rules in the foreign military financing program and gets to get all of its money annually in a lump sum at the beginning of the year. What does it do with that money? Well, it gets to put it in an interest-bearing account in the United States. So not only is it getting American taxpayer dollars, not only is it getting it entirely at the beginning of the year, whereas other countries get it in quarterly installments or as they make purchases, but it's also making interest on that money throughout the duration of the year before it makes purchases in federal accounts where interest comes from the U.S. taxpayer money as well. So the exceptions are exceptional. And it is a product of this special relationship and, of course, the interest groups that are part of this, as Lara mentioned, that have helped skew U.S. policy to the point where it not only raises questions about what American interests are being harmed here, but really goes to raise questions about the interests of people all over the world. Why is the discourse changing? I think one of the reasons that it's changing goes back to this claim about shared values. And I want to suggest that there are shared values between the United States and Israel, but they're not the ones that we often hear about. I think the real shared values between the United States and Israel is about the hypocrisy that's at the founding of both nations. The United States shares something with Israel, which is just that. Here in the United States, we were a nation of slaveholders who wanted to be free. And in Israel, we had a state that was created as a home for stateless Jews by kicking other people out of their homes and making them stateless. These hypocritical foundations exist in both nations and probably others as well. But we tell ourselves a story here in the United States about an effort to become a more perfect union and make progress away from the horrors at the foundation of our country, the hypocrisies at the foundation of our country, to progress to something better. And I would suggest that when you look at the trajectory of Israeli history, particularly as it relates to the hypocrisies at its foundation, the trajectory that Israeli history has taken is not towards a more perfect union, but towards a more permanent apartheid. There has not been a resolution to the foundational issues with Palestinians since 1948. In fact, there has been only a greater number of refugees that have been created, a greater number of settlements that have been expanded, a greater extent of Palestinian land that has been taken. And it becomes harder and harder to sustain the idea that the vision that the United States has is similar to the vision that Israel has. In fact, these are quite contradictory visions for what their futures look like, for what their societies should look like. And more people are coming to that realization. So, no matter how many standing ovations an Israeli official gets in Congress, people are waking up to the reality that this idea that Israel is some sort of vibrant democracy is a fantasy. And there is a generation of elected officials who are trying to hold on as much as they possibly can to these long-standing myths that once used to have much more traction in American society. But that's just not the case anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is because more people have come to understand the Palestinian perspective. They've come to hear more from Palestinians. They have access to greater information about what Israel's treatment of Palestinians actually looks like from a much more diverse range of information sources. And they're asking questions about how can it possibly be that an unending military occupation where millions of people have no right to vote can be described as part of a democratic system. It just doesn't make sense. So I think this is one of the main reasons that we've seen the kind of change that we have. You're right that this is borne out again and again in opinion polls that ask questions about these issues. And it's no longer just liberal Democrats. In fact, on the question of whether or not respondents sympathize with Israelis or Palestinians, liberal Democrats actually crossed the threshold back in 2016. But this past year, we saw that a majority of Democrats, period, not just liberal Democrats, but Democrats altogether, sympathize more with Palestinians than Israelis. If you follow these numbers over time, there is an exponential growth in the direction of more and more criticism of Israeli policy and the U.S. Israel relationship altogether. And so finally, how do we keep this going? I think it just comes down to continuing to do the important things that I've already discussed and that are being done to continue to center Palestinians in our stories, continue to provide information about the realities that Palestinians face on the ground, and to continue to question how the United States can continue to say it stands for these principles and these values, and yet invests most heavily in a deepening system of apartheid.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Yousef. And I want to ask you just a quick follow-up question. Would you characterize the Israel-Palestine conflict as a bipartisan issue today? Like, can we say emphatically that it is now a bipartisan issue, or do you think we're not there yet?
I think you mean, you know, are both parties sort of on the same side on this?
Right.
On
Sorry,
this issue?
I
Yeah,
framed it. Yeah.
I think, look, when we look at the elected official level, and as we saw in this past week, there is no doubt that there's still a vast majority of members of Congress who want to pretend that that's the case. When you look at the bases, when you look at the American public, it is a very, very, very different picture. I think it's important for us to keep in mind, though, that the United States Congress does not necessarily reflect public opinion on a whole range of policy issues. This is not the first one, right? And in that space in between is the role of interest groups working to shape policy in different directions. Look, for example, at the debate around gun control. Some 90-some-odd% of Americans support greater background checks as part of gun control policy. 90%. That's Republicans and Democrats and independents and almost the entire country. And yet the policy doesn't change. The reason for that is because policy change is not only about public opinion, right? And so it's important for us to understand those mechanisms and those gaps. So when it comes to, you know, your question, no, I think there is great change, and the partisan nature of this divide is more present than it's ever been. There are voices today in Congress among Democrats who are raising critical perspectives on this issue that simply didn't exist in Congress 10 years ago. We can't deny that fact either. But at the same time, Congress is not fully representative of the kind of divide that exists at this moment in the broader American public.
I just want to get to the point where the Israel-Palestine debate is like the healthcare debate. I want to get to that point where there's this vehement opposition from both sides, and obviously I meant partisan issue, not bipartisan. That's where the confusion was. Thank you for that so much, Yousef. And Lara, I want to turn to you. So we mentioned interest groups. I want to tackle that a little bit. So the development since 1967 is partly due to interest groups, the Israel Lobby, Christian Zionist groups, and other elements. How have they influenced the U.S.-Israel relationship? Because, I mean, you see them now. I mean, you mentioned money in politics, and I believe there was a congressional race in Delaware where millions of dollars were poured into a primary in Delaware, or so, you know, these small states. I mean, we're reaching an unparalleled time. So how would you contextualize, you know, Christian Zionist groups, the Israel Lobby, and other elements within this U.S.-Israel relationship?
Sure. And yeah, that's one of those questions that, you know, for years people have tried to tackle that. They've been called anti-Semitic. I would insist on distinguishing between the idea of organizations that are lobbying on the Israel issue and the Jewish community. I think that distinction is one of the problems where people get caught up in being called anti-Semitic. I think it's important to make that, I mean, it's critical to make that distinction. The fact is that from before 67, but certainly 67 to present, there is an ecosystem of organizations. They are situated in the Jewish community, but they are Israel-focused organizations. I refer to them as legacy Jewish organizations because they clearly reflect a legacy of opinion, a legacy of leadership that is largely out of step with most Jewish Americans. These are organizations that politically tend to be much more partisan and lean towards conservative Republicans who they see as better allies of Israel, notwithstanding the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community vote Democrat and progressive Democrat, more progressive than most of the Democratic Party. So you've got the legacy Jewish organizations. On top of that, you've got the burgeoning Christian Zionist organizations. And I think it's notable that, you know, I think this was sort of hinted around this in some of the other answers, but today, I mean, Israel has always had a role to play in the narratives of Christian Zionism in the U.S. The fact is that today in 2023, in past 10 years or so, it doesn't just have a role to play. It has a role to play that's right up there with abortion, gay issues, trans issues. I mean, these are the hot button identity issues for a core of conservative Republicans in this country, right? It is as much an identity issue as how you feel about, whether or not you think Roe versus Wade should fall. It's right at the center of it, which gives it a political weight in that community it hasn't had before. And again, I understand from my colleagues who watch this closely that on that side as well, if you poll younger evangelical Christian Americans, you will see they're not lining up as closely on the Israel issue as maybe people think they are. But the bottom line is that today, right now, if historically this relationship was defended in terms of U.S. interests, in terms of shared values, in terms of post 9/11, a shared Islamophobia and clash of civilizations, I mean, and let's say for progressive Jewish Americans who want to look in the mirror and say, I'm a really good progressive person and I also support Israel, a big part of that was in Israel maintaining at least the fiction of wanting peace, right? And the occupation being temporary. And in 2023, more and more Jewish Americans are coming belatedly around to recognizing that the word apartheid is not inappropriate, even if they have a hard time actually saying it out loud. An occupation that's lasted for 55 years and that is now being deepened and expanded is not temporary. And, successive Israeli governments, each time we say, well, this is the most right-wing government in Israel's history, each one successively rips more of the mask off the idea and makes it harder and harder for people to look in the mirror and say, actually, I love Israel, and I know that Israel also is actually democratic and just hasn't had a chance to prove it, right? So with that kind of cover gone, today when you look at whether it's looking at the legacy Jewish organizations or Christian Zionist organizations, or increasingly just the MAGA organizations, what we're looking at, or I use MAGA broadly for that strain of Republican Party politics, what you're seeing is Israel becoming part of the, culture wars. It's the woke battles. We see this right now with the battle around the right to boycott Israel, which has now become subsumed into the anti-ESG battle. For folks who don't know, ESG is this whole, it's environmental social governance. It's this idea that investments, like the corporations should be held accountable for their actions by shareholders, by consumers, all that. And the problem with ESG, even for people who like it, is that if you apply your ESG screens on everybody, Israel doesn't score very well. And its companies get caught up in these screens and people say, oh, no, we can't let that happen. That's anti-Semitic BDS. And so now we have a situation where, defending Israel has become caught up in a very partisan war to basically say that corporations should have no limits on what they do, and to try to impose any screens at all is actually un-American. It's communist. It's fascist. How dare you? I'm not exaggerating. There, last week this week we've had multiple hearings on the Hill just on ESG, and in many cases the legislation that they are using to target ESG is openly modeled on anti-BDS legislation, right? They created the template by going after BDS, and now they're doing this. So you have all of that, and you've got this bizarre confluence in a moment when we actually have the greatest anti-Semitism in any of our lifetimes. Real anti-Semitism, which isn't hard to define. It's that hatred, threats, prejudice, discrimination, attacks on Jewish people because they're Jewish, right? Not for any other reason. It's because they're Jewish. That's anti-Semitism. But in this moment, we're saying, no. That's kind of anti-Semitism, but the real anti-Semitism is the criticism of Israel. And on this one, the American Jewish community and the ADL can stand shoulder to shoulder with the most right-wing organizations in the states that want to take away free speech on everything and say, but on this we agree, we have to shut down criticism of Israel because it's anti-Semitism. So it's a bizarre confluence. The last thing I want to say, and I actually did a podcast on this a few months ago, which I really encourage people to watch, the idea of shared values. I think it's important to actually pay attention to how some of the stuff, and actually Yousef was on this podcast, he was brilliant, is the interplay between what's happening in Israel and what's happening in the U.S. A lot of people are aware of the efforts to quote unquote reform the judiciary in Israel, which I know for anyone who cares about Palestinian rights seems like an irrelevant side story because it's not democratic. The judiciary does not provide justice for Palestinians. All of that, agree. But in terms of what is happening for changing the judiciary as it applies to Jewish Israelis, that energy is coming largely, in this case, from an organization called the Kohelet Policy Forum. Pay attention. This is an organization which is funded largely by MAGA billionaires in the US, who are also working in the US to promote candidates who want to do the same things in the US that they're doing in Israel. You have this back and forth. And the people from the Kohelet Policy Forum are the ones who are testifying on Capitol Hill in support of the policies on Israel-Palestine that align with the hardline support Israel, and anything it does is okay. You know, it's always self-defense. It should be able to hold on to all the land because it's, you know, otherwise it's anti-Semitic. It's all really quite deeply interconnected. And that's not some conspiracy theory. That's like people saying, I work here, they pay my salary, I'm on the Hill testifying here, and we're also writing the legislation to try to get this done in Israel. So I think the shared values actually do exist, and they're deeply enmeshed in the efforts in both countries to move things further and further to something that looks a lot more like Hungary than it does at least how people have their self-image of the state of Israel or the country of America.
You know, sometimes the answer is not yes or no. It's what do you mean by that? Just like when somebody asks, have the Oslo Accords been successful? Well, it depends on who you're talking about or what side you're referring to. So just a quick follow-up. I did Google your definition. I did not see it in the IRA definition, the one that you just gave. So maybe you should let them know to add that in there. So that would be.
I will just say, if you look at the definition that the Biden administration articulated in its own words in the new anti-Semitism strategy, it actually sounds a lot more like what I just said. The IRA definition gets an indirect, like literally, they use indirect language, past tense looking backwards reference. It's in there because that has been U.S. policy in two areas, the Trump's executive order and in the State Department monitoring anti-Semitism overseas. But the language that I just articulated is much closer to what the Biden administration actually said they view as anti-Semitism.
Right, and I think what's more problematic in the IRA definition is the examples given for the definition of anti-Semitism as opposed to the actual definition. And just a quick, I'm going to piggyback and if you want, Raed, you can piggyback off of what Lara said. There was a lot that was said there, but another element to this changing tide in the past 10 years have been the growing calls for conditioning U.S. aid to Israel by politicians, and you know it's becoming a growing issue. And one example is the Betty McCollum bill. The sponsorship on that is growing, co-sponsorship. So this argument has gained traction. How can we use the moment that we're in right now to make that conditionality a reality? And you can piggyback off of what Laura said as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the bigger question here is about the MOU. The MOU that was signed last, it was negotiated in 2016 by President Obama. It went into effect in 2018. So it will last until 2028. So we are going to see a new MOU getting negotiated in the next couple of years. And that is a big battle that all of us have to engage with at one point, because many of the questions that you brought up, Tariq, today have to do with the MOU. The MOU, for example, the last roundabout, we got one small victory in the MOU, which Yousef mentioned earlier. It's the overseas procurement, the OSP accounts. It used to be set at 26.3% of the entirety of U.S. funding. Under the Obama administration, they negotiated tapering it off to zero by 2028. So now we're at like the 13th percentile. That's very important because, as Yousef was saying, we're not only giving unconditional aid to Israel, we're giving them cash to buy their own weapons from us. It's unheard of. It's insane that we do this. So at least that is going to taper off. But unfortunately, the MOU, did contain some other provisions to try to maintain the $3.88 billion as the steady stream where Israel does not ask for more money. That was not the case because Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States used the MOU to mandate the United States to give $3.8 billion a year as a minimum. It was actually included in the NDAA a couple of years ago. So now it's in US law. We have to give Israel $3.8 billion, whether we like it or not. We have to give them $3.8 billion. But on top of that, the restriction for adding more money was circumvented last year when Israel got an additional $1 billion using some vague language in the MOU that would allow for additional funds in case of emergency. There was no emergency, but they got $1 billion for something that should not have been funded at all. So the MOU was not good. The premise of the MOU is not good. Tariq, I would say that many organizations, including Dawn, my organization, we're not calling for conditioning military aid to Israel. We're calling for cutting U.S. military aid to Israel. That's the main call out there, is not conditioning. There are different calls. There is a call out there to say we have to cut U.S. military aid to Israel. We shouldn't give Israel $3.8 billion a year. It's a rich country. Their economy is doing much better than ours, I have to say. They don't need us to subsidize their military by giving them 20% of their budget. They don't need us. And they're committing crimes with our money. We should not be giving them $1. So that is the moral ask. The moral ask is not conditioning. The second ask, in case cutting aid is not available, would be restricting aid to any units that have been committing violations or any actions that are contrary to U.S. and international law. For example, restricting U.S. aid from supporting the expansion or protection of illegal settlements in the West Bank. That's an activity that could be restricted. Restricting U.S. aid to a unit that has committed gross violations of human rights. Like, for example, the unit that killed Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian journalist. There is a consensus out there that this was an act of extrajudicial killing, which is recognized as one of the 4 gross violations of human rights that the State Department takes into consideration to suspend U.S. aid. So we have to restrict aid there. The third level is what you mentioned, Tariq, which is, the issue of conditioning, which is what the U.S. does with many countries, including Egypt. Release some of the prisoners. We're going to give you a couple $100 million. Release it there. I think that hasn't been working very well. But even that has not been utilized in the case of Israel. I would say, in a scale of 1 to 10, cutting aid to Israel is the most, strongest measure for accountability, and doing nothing is the lowest measure of accountability. We are now at doing nothing. We are doing absolutely nothing. We give Israel a blank check every month with no accountability. There are no measures to maintain our own laws while we're giving them the money. So having conversation about where the next MOU is negotiated and what are the provisions put there is important. Like, for example, for me, I think one of the most important things is to ensure that Israel does not enjoy some sort of a exceptional blank check to break U.S. law for another decade by using another MOU that would be embedded in a must-pass legislation. So I think that is an issue that we have to keep in mind, that while we're dealing with the daily, putting fires every day. Today, Israel invaded another town. Today, settlers killed another U.S. citizens. Today, I think one of the bigger pictures to keep in mind is how can we, as a movement trying to fight against apartheid and racism, how can we start planning to oppose another blank check MOU for 10 years from now?
I totally forgot about that. That the expiration. We're halfway in. So yeah, it's definitely coming up. And look, for the sake of time, I want to get maybe 1 or 2 audience questions in here, and one of them is regarding something very, very important. It's kind of a hot topic right now amongst activists, is the visa waiver program, which is administered by the Department of Homeland Security. And this program allows nationals of specific countries to travel to the U.S. for tourism and so on. The question is pretty much, can you address the new memorandum of understanding that was announced yesterday regarding vis-a-vis Israel being admitted to the U.S. visa waiver program? And Yousef, I want to put that question to you.
Yeah, happy to answer this, and I want to begin by talking about something called shared fiction. If you read the recent column by Tom Friedman, who's become something of a Biden whisperer and portal through which Biden and Netanyahu are communicating to each other now, you may have noted that he actually referred to something which is the topic of our discussion, a shared interest between Israel and the United States. And he called this the shared fiction, that one day there would be an end to Israel's occupation, and it was only temporary, and that there would one day be a two-state solution. In other words, it was a U.S. interest to pretend that peace was possible, that a two-state solution was possible. And this was an interest that was shared with Israel. What did he mean by that? One of the things that he meant by that, for example, and we should all be able to remember that it is no coincidence that both the Madrid Peace Conference and the Oslo or the roadmap process came about during a time when the United States was going to war in the Middle East, in Iraq. The United States has always understood the need to use the Palestinian issue to give itself space within the Middle East to carry out other imperial objectives, even if they have to pretend that things are moving forward. Israel has been the United States' partner in playing pretend when it needed that latitude within the Middle East. And so I think another shared fiction, unfortunately, that we're talking about today is one that the Biden administration seems to be prepared to engage in with Israel over this issue of reciprocity. This principle of reciprocity is key to any country joining the United States visa waiver program. It means that the country joining the program has to treat Americans the way that America treats their citizens when they come in, and to treat all Americans the same way, to treat them equally. The reason that Israel has not been able to get into the visa waiver program, among other issues, is that it explicitly discriminates against Palestinian Americans and denies them entry through specific ports of entry that it permits other Americans to enter into. For bizarre reasons that have a lot to do with the pandemic and delays in visa processing, the Israelis happen to qualify in this fiscal year because of their low visa refusal rate for visa applications to actually make it in to be considered, nominated for this program. And the deadline for that is September 30th of this year. This has been an outstanding issue for decades. And yet now, at the 11th hour, just before this deadline in the next couple of months, the United States and Israel have announced that they've come to an understanding on the implementation of a set of policies that both are welcoming as a pathway towards reciprocity. And I think this is extremely dangerous because when you look at the actual details of the agreement, what the countries have agreed to, it's not reciprocity. It's not equal treatment. And what the countries have apparently agreed to is that several different classes of Palestinians will be treated through several different types of processes. Some Palestinian Americans will be able to travel through the airport in Raed. Some Palestinians will have to apply for a permit to enter into Israel through the Israeli military, even though they are U.S. citizens, those who are residing in the West Bank. Those who are residing in Gaza who happen to be U.S. citizens will have to go through a completely different process. And so this, unfortunately, this memorandum of understanding between the United States and Israel for the visa waiver program only seems to be a United States acceptance of the occupation regime onto Palestinian American citizens, which is a real betrayal, I think, of the administration's responsibilities towards its citizens. But there seems to be a willingness, at least at the political level, to engage in the shared fiction that this amounts to reciprocity. but that's not the reality on the ground once again.
Thank you for that, Yousef. That's something that we are definitely pushing as well, to make sure that Israel is not admitted into the visa waiver program. Last question, because we are almost out of time here. Raed, I want to ask you this question from the audience. Is there language in the Memorandum of Understanding to restrict funding to specific units, or is that something we could hope for in the next one?
Usually, memorandums of understanding, MOUs, they don't really get to that level of granular detail. So the MOU doesn't really get into that detail. What I was referring to as for laws restricting funding, these are laws that we have on the books in the United States that apply to every country, to every condition. There are two similar regimes of laws. The one that applies to this case is the Foreign Assistance Act of 1969. It was amended in the mid-90s by Senator Leahy. So those laws are supposed to restrict funding of foreign military units. I think the upcoming MOU, we can fight, for example, to add more affirmative language that the United States and Israel would, get out of their way to make sure that U.S. law is respected, unlike in the past. But I don't think it's going to get to a point where the MOU itself restricts or unrestricts the funding of units. The bigger picture here is that we need to keep an eye out on that historic moment that's coming and make sure that it's not going to use to fuel the blank check policy that Israel has been enjoying for decades.
Okay, and there's a lot more here in the chat, but we are out of time. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements before we let our panel go. Since 2015, American Muslims for Palestine has organized an annual Palestine Advocacy Day and Training Weekend to educate students, community leaders, and organizers on civic engagement and policy work exclusively on the issue of Palestine. And as of 2021, Palestine Advocacy Day was handed off to Americans for Justice in Palestine, AJP Action, which is AMP's 501c4 affiliate organization. We are proud to co-sponsor this year's Palestine Advocacy Days. Join us and register today to secure your spot at ajpaction.org. Again, it's ajpaction.org. It's right on the screen there. And the second announcement is this year's Palestine Convention, entitled Nakba 75, 1 year closer to a free Palestine, will emphasize Palestinian indigeneity, imbue our future generation of activists with a proper conceptualization of Al-Nakba, which is catastrophe, and better position them to be part of the ongoing liberation endeavor. Mark your calendars. That will be Thanksgiving weekend in Chicago, Illinois. Be part of this critical moment in history and join the largest gathering for Palestine in the U.S. You can register today at PalestineConvention.org. Again, that is PalestineConvention.org. I want to thank our wonderful panel so very much. I know this topic can go on for hours. Thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope to see you guys soon. Thank you.